So before we get into the details of specific policies, let me just step back and paint the broad picture. What exactly is the problem that we're addressing in education? To put it succinctly, it's a productivity crisis. It's a productivity crisis because per pupil spending, adjusted for inflation, has more than doubled in the last 4 decades, while outcomes for students have been flat. They haven't gone down. Kids are not significantly worse off than they were 4 decades ago, but they're no better off. And any time an organization spends more than twice as much to produce no more in outcome, you have a problem. You have a productivity problem. Any industry that tried to, that was unable to improve its output despite doubling its inputs would be an industry that would be gone. But education doesn't go away. Public schools don't go away. They just keep going. And so it's frustrating. We normally expect that if we double resources that we should get better results, but we don't. Now why don't we? And again, in very broad terms, the problem is that the resources that are devoted to schools are unattached to the outcomes. That is, it doesn't matter whether schools do better or worse for them to get resources. They are entitled to resources and they receive them by right rather than by effort. Now, this is not to say that there aren't people working very hard in schools all across the country. We have wonderful people teaching in schools. In fact, I think that's why things are not worse than they are, is that we have a lot of very devoted people working hard in a system that is not well designed for them to produce the results that they should. The problem is not the people in schools. The problem is the design of the system. And the central part of this design flaw is that resources are unattached to outcomes. Now, how can we attach resources to outcomes? How can we make it so that schools earn revenue based upon their effort and accomplishment? And there are really 2 big strategies out there for doing this. Accountability and choice. And these are really just 2 sides of the same coin. They are ways of allocating resources to organizations based upon meeting desired goals. Okay, so accountability is simply a centralized form of attaching resources to results. That is, some central authority determines what the goals are, identifies a way of measuring what those desired outcomes are, and then has a formula that it decides for how to allocate resources based upon achieving those goals. So you can have a state accountability test, you can have grading of schools, you can have bonuses that go to teachers, or extra resources that go to schools based upon meeting the goals of the central authority. Choice is the exact same thing, except it's decentralized. You're still attaching resources to outcomes, but rather than having a central authority decide what the goals are, how to measure them, and how to allocate the resources to reward accomplishment of the goals, you have individual consumers deciding. And they decide how to allocate resources that either they own or that they control, that are given to them by someone else, but they have control over. And they choose where they send those resources based upon whether those institutions are satisfying the goals that they have. Okay? So that in a very broad brush, that I think is the nature of the problem we face, and I think these are the 2 types of solutions that we're considering. Now, to say this in a very broad way doesn't tell us exactly how to do it, and there are lots of devils in these details, as it turns out. It's very hard to design all these things right and to successfully attach resources to outcomes. And so let me tell you about a few efforts that have been underway in Florida, and there are counterparts in Georgia, and what the results of those efforts have been. I should say that Florida as a whole has done very well over the last decade or so. This is a state that went from being very much below average in terms of NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, to being actually above average, and some really remarkable accomplishments, particularly among minority students in Florida. Hispanic students in Florida, for example, are outperforming the average student in over 30 states. Okay, so if Florida Hispanics were their own state on NAEP, they would be well above average as a state. They outperform the average student in California, for example. African American students in Florida, if they were their own state, are currently outperforming the average student in 8 states, and are about to surpass 6 more, which is really, quite an accomplishment. And so Florida still has a long way to go, but it has made some remarkable progress. So what are some of the things it's done? Well, it developed a state accountability test, the FCAT, and then it developed a grading system based on that test. And the grading system grades schools A through F. And it's interesting because in prior incarnations of Florida's accountability system, they had a test and they had a grading system, but the labels that were given to schools were what are called fuzzy labels. So they were, excelling, progressing, meeting goals, or and the trouble is that no one's quite sure what the different categories were or what they meant, and they all sound pretty cheerful. In need of improvement is the bad one, but it's still, it's not so bad, right? And so then they ditched that and they switched to another grading system where they said, okay, let's get rid of fuzzy labels, let's have 1 to 5. And the problem with that approach is no one was quite sure whether they wanted to be a 1 or a 5. And so, it's not obvious what the correct one is. And so for transparency's sake, they went to A through F, because pretty much everyone knows that an A and B are pretty darn good, and the D and F are not so good, and the C, you're in trouble. Right, so everyone could understand that, and then they attached various rewards and sanctions to receiving different grades. On the high end, schools got bonuses that they could allocate to their staff based on having high grades, getting an A. And on the other end, if schools received 2 Fs in a 4-year period, they had to offer vouchers to their students to leave. If they were chronically failing, if they couldn't get their act together, then they had to at least open the door and let people go. So they attached these rewards on top and bottom, but they also applied accountability to individual students. In particular, they instituted a promotion policy, a test-based promotion policy in 3rd grade. Students had to perform at better than the very bottom category of reading performance to be automatically promoted to the next grade. They also instituted an exit exam for high school, so students had to pass an exam in 10th grade in order to receive a high school diploma. So there are 2 gates that students have to perform on a test to a satisfactory level in order to get through the gate to move on. Now, the other things that Florida has done that are interesting is that they have offered all students with a disability, all students with an IEP in the state, are eligible for a voucher. There are more than 400,000 of them in Florida, of which more than 20,000 are currently using a voucher to attend a private school. We're talking about less than a 5% take-up rate. So most students are relatively content where they are, but students who are unhappy with the services they receive, if those students have a disability, they can seek another school. So those are a bunch of the choice and accountability ideas that are underway in Florida, and you actually have several of these here in Georgia. So, for example, Georgia has a test-based promotion policy. Georgia has a voucher for special needs students. I'm not sure that Georgia has the same results from those same policies that Florida does. In fact, I strongly suspect that it doesn't. But I can't know for sure because I can't get the data to analyze it. Which I think is an important lesson, that it's not just having the right general concept, and it's not even adopting the right ideas for policies, but you have to design them right and implement them right so that they produce the results you want. So let me go through what the effects of some of these policies were in Florida and why I fear that you haven't quite had the same results in Georgia. So first let's talk about the social promotion policy in Florida. So students have to perform at better than the very lowest level in reading in 3rd grade to receive an automatic promotion to 4th grade. Now, as it turns out, there are exemptions. 6 good cause exemptions are available for a variety of reasons. For example, if a student has a disability, if a student has limited English, is an English language learner, limited English proficiency, if a student has performed well on an alternative measure, if the teacher assembles a portfolio of work to demonstrate that the student warrants promotion, or if the student has been retained previously. These are all good cause exemptions for students to be promoted nevertheless. As it turns out, 41% of all students who performed below the test threshold in Florida the first year was adopted received one of these 6 exemptions. So the exemptions are fairly widespread, but not universal. 59% were still retained, and that amounted to a little more than 13% of all 3rd grade students in Florida, the first year the policy was adopted, repeated 3rd grade. That's quite a big deal. It was up from less than 3% the year prior. So retention had been a very rare thing, and it became much more common once there was a test requirement for automatic promotion. So what were the effects of this policy? Well, I should tell you that the conventional wisdom among educators was that this was an awful idea. And that wisdom was based upon decades of research that had found that retention produced bad outcomes for kids over the long run. It made them more likely to drop out, damaged self-esteem, and the difficulty is that that research was based on a different kind of policy, and because of that had a fundamental methodological flaw. So the problem is this, that retained students that teachers identify for retention, as opposed to a test identifying for retention, are rare. So teachers very rarely seek to retain a student. And if they do seek to retain a student, they often have some very strong reasons for doing so. They know something that's going on that makes them think they need to retain the student and have that student repeat the grade. And researchers would then try to compare the future progress of these rarely retained students to other students who were promoted. The trouble is that these retained students are very different from promoted students. Now, researchers could try to control for observed differences. They could control for, let's say, test scores, or their free lunch status, or their demographic group. But that doesn't really get to the particular problems that cause the teacher to say, I want to retain this student. So I mean, imagine there are 2 students with the same test scores, with the same free lunch status, from the same ethnic background, and the teacher says, I want to retain that student, I want to promote that student. The teacher had a reason for retaining one and promoting the other, and the researcher doesn't know what that reason is. And it's that reason that causes their performance to be different later on. Maybe retention had nothing to do with it. Maybe retention helped. But still, whatever problem the teacher saw caused that student to perform less well later on. And so not surprisingly, students with extra problems have less good outcomes later on. They're more likely to drop out. They have lower self-esteem. So the nice thing about this new policy in Florida that switches from teacher discretion retention to test-based retention with exemptions is that it allows for an apple-to-apple comparison. And in fact, allowed for two kinds of apple-to-apple comparisons that Marcus Winters and I did and published in the journal Education, Finance, and Policy. One kind of comparison we did is we looked at students who performed below the test threshold the year before the policy was adopted and tracked their future performance, and we compared them to the students who performed below the test threshold the first year that the policy was adopted. These two groups of students are all very similar in their profile as a whole. They're all low performing, they're all below the threshold. The thing that distinguishes them is what year they happen to have been born. If you were born a year earlier, you were promoted. If you were born a year later, you were retained. But the year in which you were born shouldn't have a big impact on your educational outcomes. If we compare those two groups over time, we found that the retained students, the students who were born a year later and were subject to the policy, their future progress was much more rapid than their counterparts from the year before, who were equally low performing but who were nevertheless promoted. But that comparison is less rigorous than the next one I'm going to describe to you. And it's less rigorous because it's possible that there are other things that differ from one year to the next. Perhaps Florida changed a lot of its approaches or adopted some new reading program or something else that changed at the same time. And we wouldn't be able to disentangle that with comparing one cohort to the next cohort. So instead, in our second type of comparison, which is much more rigorous, we did what's called a regression discontinuity analysis. And that's fancy talk for the fact that there's a bright line that if students perform above it, automatically promoted. They perform below it, they are default retained. They're retained except for exemptions. So the two students right around that threshold, the student barely above the threshold and the student barely below the threshold, are virtually identical. It's almost chance whether you answered one more question right on the exam or not, whether you were just above the threshold or just below. It's sort of like, the last student admitted to Harvard and the first student rejected from Harvard are going to be very similar, right? So it's, right around that threshold, it's kind of random whether you just got in or just didn't. And so if you just got promoted versus just got retained, you're going to have very similar students. That's a nice apple-to-apple comparison. We could compare their future performance, and we could compare them, even though they were taking tests in future years in different grades, because Florida's test is what's called vertically scaled. That is, there's a measure of how much the students know that is comparable across all grades, no matter which grade test you take. So what we found is that after 1 year, the retained students, those just below the threshold, knew more on the reading test, could demonstrate more skill than those who performed just above the threshold. The difference wasn't huge after 1 year, but after 2 years, the difference grew to be fairly large, the equivalent of almost half a standard deviation difference. Now I know that standard deviation is the distance on a bell curve, how far you move on a bell curve. So from one end of a bell curve to the other end of a bell curve is 4 standard deviations. To give you an idea of how big that is, to move half a standard deviation is 1/8 of kind of almost the whole distribution. But to translate it into something that might be more accessible, we also converted it into the equivalence of months of instruction. So how many additional months of instruction would you need to get a half a standard deviation benefit? And it was 6.5. So out of a 9-month year, 6.5 more months of instruction is the equivalent of the advantage that the retained students had over the promoted students. So even though the retained students were being exposed to 1 grade less of curriculum, they could demonstrate more skill than their counterparts who'd been promoted. And that this benefit grew larger over time. And this suggests that learning to walk is very important for running. And unless we kind of really work on those walking skills, the running skills just don't come along. And this problem gets worse over time. Now, switching to Georgia, Georgia has adopted a test-based promotion policy. It also had exemptions available. And the exemption procedure, as I understand it, although there may be people here who know this much better than I, the exemption procedure was that if the school, if the administrator, teacher, and parent met, discussed it, and decided that it would be best for the student to be promoted, they could promote the student, and they would all sign a document saying we've met and we think it's best for the student to be promoted. That was based on kind of professional and parent judgment. And there were many districts in Georgia, according to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, that exempted virtually all of their students who were subject to the retention policy. They just exempted everyone. And they did so without having these meetings or signing these documents. They just exempted. And then when approached by reporters from the Journal-Constitution about why they did this, they said, well, we know that retention is a bad idea, and so we don't want to do it. And as far as I know, no one was fired, no one was sanctioned, no one went to jail, nothing happened to anyone. There was a law. The people of Georgia said, we believe that you have to be able to read in our public schools at a certain level to be promoted to 4th grade. And then they told their employees, the people who work for the state, that this is what we want you to do. And the employees said, no, we're not doing it. And that was that. That's the strangest thing. I suspect that if virtually everyone is exempted in many districts, that the policy didn't work. Because it's hard to produce any effect if no one's actually subject to the policy. So there's basically a fundamental implementation failure in Georgia. Now maybe it's turned around since then, maybe it's changed since then. I don't know, I haven't followed it since then. You could tell me more about it. It hasn't changed. Okay. So that's social promotion. Let me tell you about some choice research I've done in Florida that has a counterpart in Georgia as well. Let me first talk about special education vouchers, and then I'll talk about vouchers in general. So special education vouchers are, in Florida, it's called the McKay Scholarship Program, named after the state senator who sponsored the bill and had a disabled child of his own. And it's a remarkable program in that the voucher amount varies based upon the severity of the disability. So whatever amount is provided to the public school for that child is the amount of the voucher. So a more severely disabled student receives a larger voucher. The voucher is good for whatever the public schools get to spend on that child. That's the amount that a private school would get to spend on that child. The program began in very pilot form in 1999, but grew much larger 2001, and it's been growing steadily ever since then, but not in any dramatic fashion. Again, a little more than 20,000 students using one of these vouchers now, and they can go to any school they like, public or private, religious or secular, and the school does not have to accept the voucher as payment in full. If the private school wishes, it can charge more, and parents can supplement. The voucher, I should be clear, is worth whatever is spent on the child in the public school or the tuition of the private school, whichever is less. So it turns out the average value of the voucher was about $7,500, significantly less than the average spent on disabled students in the public school, because on average the private school tuitions were less. So there was the whichever was less part was keeping the expenditures down compared to the expenditures on those students in public schools. Marcus Winters and I, again, analyzed data related to this program, and the results are forthcoming in the journal Education Evaluation Policy Analysis, where we found two interesting effects. So one thing we looked at was what happens to disabled students who remain in traditional public schools. Is their achievement hurt by the loss of students and resources to other schools? And so to measure variation in exposure to competition from McKay, what we did is we counted how many McKay receiving private schools there were within a 5 and 10 mile radius of each public school. So basically a public school was exposed to more competitive pressure from McKay if it had more private schools that were participating in McKay nearby. And if it had fewer of those nearby, then it was exposed to less competition. And what we found was that the more competitive pressure a traditional public school felt from McKay, as measured by having more McKay receiving private schools nearby, the better the academic achievement of disabled students who remain in the public schools. So the program was improving the academic achievement of disabled students in public schools by giving them the option to leave. The public schools had increased motivation to earn their revenue so that they wouldn't walk out the door. Okay? The other interesting thing about the program is that it also reduced the identification of students as disabled. So there's been a very big increase in the identification of students as disabled in the United States. This is happening all over, and it's very dramatic. So that now more than 13% of all students nationwide are considered disabled. And this is almost double what it was 3 decades ago. We don't believe that there's anything that has happened in the population that has caused an epidemic of disabilities. There's nothing in the water. Basically, disabilities are, for the most part, immutable and random and unchanging over time. So whatever distribution of disabilities exist in the world today should be more or less the same that existed several decades ago. We have no strong reason to expect a huge change. And yet there's been this very big increase. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is the increasing willingness and motivation on the part of schools to identify students as disabled. It's not that there are more disabled students, it's that more students are being identified as disabled. And almost all of the growth in disabilities has occurred in one category, which is called specific learning disability. And it includes a range of processing difficulties, such as dyslexia. Dyslexia is an example of a specific learning disability. If the growth is not in autism, I know, people bring it up. Yes, there has been growth in autism, but autism is tiny compared to specific learning disability. So it doesn't really matter. It's just not big enough to make a difference. The growth is in specific learning disability. And there's actually been some decline in a few categories. For example, mental retardation has declined. Some of that has to do with improvements in public health. We're successfully removing lead paint from housing. This has been good for kids. We've had a decline in traumatic brain injuries. Kids wear helmets. They're in car seats. This has been a good thing. And we're also much more effective at identifying babies in distress during delivery and having C-sections and getting them out before they experience oxygen deprivation and brain damage. And so all of these improvements in medicine and public health ought to, if anything, be reducing the incidence of disabilities in the population. And these more objectively identified categories like mental retardation, traumatic brain injury, these actually have experienced a decline, a little bit. But specific learning disability has more than doubled, almost tripled. Why? Well, it happens to be the lowest cost to serve and the most ambiguous to identify. The standard that's often used in schools to identify it is simply that a student is performing below average on state achievement tests. So a student is below average on achievement, And we then can search for explanations for this. One possibility would be that the student has been taught poorly. And so maybe the student doesn't know things, not because the student has a processing problem in the brain, but because the student hasn't been taught well. But schools are disinclined to find this as the explanation. Another possibility is that the students have messed up home lives. You know, things are difficult at home or in their community. And these are very sad things, but they're not disabilities. Poverty is not a disability. It is a social problem, but it is not a disability. We can't confuse these things. But you know, schools, very well intentioned. I mean, I think that what schools do is they see kids struggling and they figure out how can we help these kids move along, and then they realize, well, the state has made money available to us if only we identify the student as having a processing problem. If we just say we've done a bad job or the kid has difficulty at home, we don't get any extra resources to help the kid. But if we say he has a processing problem in his brain, we get money. And it's not that they're greedy, you know, it's that they want to figure out a way to get resources to help kids. And so this is the system has incentivized them to identify kids as disabled, even when they're not. And besides, it's ambiguous, so the schools don't even really know if they're disabled or not. So they're inclined to identify them. Short term, this is a very well-intentioned act on the part of people in schools, but long term, it's very bad. It's very bad because it alters everyone's expectations about that child who has now been identified as having a processing problem in the brain. The child has new expectations about himself, the parents have new expectations about that child, all the educators have new expectations. And this has a very negative effect on the child long term, even though it's completely well-intentioned. So how can we control the over-identification of specific learning disability? Well, one of the ways you can do it is offer vouchers for disabled students. The reason why this works is because it provides a financial check on what is currently a one-way incentive to over-identify. There's a risk now if you over-identify. If you over-identify in the past, you got extra money. If you over-identify now, you get extra money, but you might lose all of the money. You might lose the extra amount and the base amount, because the child walks out the door with all of the money, right? And so now schools think twice. They hesitate a little bit more. And in fact, we found that's exactly what we found happened in Florida, that when competition increased, as students had more options to walk out the door because there were more private McKay receiving schools nearby, the incidence of SLD, specific learning disability identification, went down. Now, Georgia has a special ed voucher program. I know virtually nothing about it. I fully confess. I'd love to. Okay, well, I'd love to hear more about it here, and I won't take too much longer because I know we have lots to talk about together. But I want to learn more about it. I believe that there are some important design differences that I would expect would make the Georgia program work less well than the Florida program. And main one, if I understand it correctly, is that Georgia doesn't have the fully variable voucher amounts. That is, it's not the full amount of whatever is spent on the child given the child's disability. And this is going to skew all sorts of things. So if you make it so that the more severely disabled student is a money loser for private schools because the voucher amount won't cover all that student needs, then you provide a disincentive for private schools to take those kids. And not surprisingly, they won't. I mean, we shouldn't expect private schools to lose money, right? They're not in, even a friend of mine working at a not-profit said, not-profit doesn't mean for loss. So they can't do it. And so you'll have kind of a skew in who can participate. And then actually it'll be even skewed the other way. It may be too much money given kids with certain very mild disabilities, and they'll be way over enrolled in this kind of program. And this will also alter the response of the traditional public schools because they'll find themselves losing their low-cost, easy-to-serve disabled students and retaining high-cost, difficult-to-serve disabled students, and they'll rightly complain that they're being kind of stuck with extra burdens. So it's important, designing these things and implementing these things correctly is important. Once again, Georgia seems to have, I think, although maybe you'll teach me about this, but I believe that on special ed vouchers, it's great that Georgia has something. That's an amazing thing, but again, I think that the design of it came up short. Lastly, let me just talk in general about voucher research. We can divide voucher research into 3 areas. One is what does getting choice do for those who get to choose, who participate in programs? Second is, what does choice do for students who remain in traditional public schools who are not active choosers? And the third is, what does it do for our civil society? What does it do for, because schools aren't just about skills, economically useful skills for kids. We're also training future citizens, and so we want to pay attention to that as well. And very briefly, the voucher research on participant effects, what happens to those who use a voucher to go to a private school. We have 10 random assignment studies on voucher effects. That is, these are studies where there were more students who wanted a voucher than there were spots. They held a lottery. Some people won the lottery and got a voucher, some people didn't. And the 2 groups are distinguished only by chance. Some won the lottery, some lost the lottery. It's just like a medical experiment, right? Where by chance some people get the pill, by chance some people get the placebo. You can track them over time. The 2 groups on average are identical, save for what kind of intervention they got, whether they got a voucher or not. And in 9 out of 10 of those random assignment studies, there are significant benefits for the voucher recipients, at least some subgroup of the voucher recipients. Now it varies from study to study. The pattern is that the more disadvantaged the students, the bigger the benefit. So the positive effects of vouchers seem to be concentrated among lower income minority students. Higher income white students tend not to benefit as much, or not at all, from vouchers. This is not too surprising. Basically, the less choice that you currently have, the more deprived you are now, the bigger the effect of getting choice would be. It's sort of like the effect of vitamin C on scurvy. If you already get a lot of vitamin C, but scurvy is a condition that comes from not getting enough vitamin C. If you already get enough vitamin C, getting more vitamin C doesn't reduce the incidence of scurvy. It has no effect on it. You're already getting enough. But if you don't have enough vitamin C, getting some makes a huge difference, which is why British sailors are limeys, because they would have lime with them so that they would get vitamin C, go out on ocean voyages and not get scurvy. So similarly, unfortunately, we have pockets of our population who are deprived of the vitamin C of choice. They don't have enough choices available to them, either because of economics or because of geography. And so those are the populations for which there's a bigger effect. Moving to what happens to students who remain in public schools, there are 5 studies in Florida and 4 studies in Milwaukee of what happens to students who remain in traditional public schools when choice and competition is increased. And the results are the same as the ones I told you about for the McKay Scholarship for disabled students. That is, when choice and competition increases, the performance of students in traditional public schools also increases. I should emphasize that the magnitude of these effects is not huge. Okay? It doesn't transform public schools and turn them into incredibly effective places. It doesn't produce miracles. And this, again, shouldn't be too surprising to us. First, the amount of expanded choice and competition that all of these programs offer is modest. And not surprisingly, modest programs produce modest effects. But also, we can't expect schools to experience miraculous change. all progress is gradual, and we ought to focus on getting every bit of improvement we can get, and not hold out for miracles before we decide to do something. And lastly, part of what has inhibited the response of traditional public schools is their knowledge that ultimately they can be held harmless against loss. That is, businesses respond to competitive pressure differently because they have an acute awareness of the fact that they can disappear. Public schools don't have that same awareness. They can lose some students, they can lose some revenue, but they never really feel like they're going to go away as a system. And so that mutes their response. So that's what happens that's the second part of the voucher research. And the third part of the voucher research is what happens to students what happens to our civic values. And I'll talk about two little bits of this. One is integration. A lot of people, especially in the South, have a very negative feeling about vouchers because they have a historical memory that vouchers were a mechanism used to evade Brown v. Board of Education. And so it's a very bad word for a lot of people, particularly in the South. And that's true. On the other hand, public schools have their own shameful history with regard to segregation, because it was, after all, public schools that were segregated by law for almost a century. So I don't know why we're happy about one kind of institution and not the other, but that's the way we are. There's been a lot of research on what happens to the integration in schools when we offer more choices. And what's interesting is that you find slightly better integration when students have expanded choices than when they don't. And the reason for it is that traditional public schools primarily assign students to schools based on where they live, and housing patterns are very segregated. So we reproduce segregated housing patterns in schools. In fact, we provide incentives for people to live on one side of a boundary rather than the other side of the boundary for fear of being in the wrong school. So we exacerbate racial segregation in housing because we attach housing to schooling. What choice does is it detaches schooling from housing. And by doing so, we allow people to cross those boundaries more easily and to find some transcendent mission that might bring them together in a school. It could be a shared philosophy of pedagogy, it could be a shared religious mission, could be a shared aspiration for excellence. Whatever it is that may draw people together from different backgrounds and across political boundaries. It happens a little bit. Now, I mean, the fear is that if we gave people more choice, they'd run further away from each other. The trouble is people have already done that by choosing where to live. So to the extent that people are going to run away from each other, they already can and have. And to the extent that people want to get together, removing the barrier of political boundaries seems to be beneficial. And then the other side of it, let me just talk about political tolerance. So we're afraid sometimes that if we send kids to non-public schools, that they won't learn really to appreciate our political values, that they won't be tolerant of people who are unlike them, who hold different political views. And political scientists have actually developed a way of measuring tolerance. It's pretty neat. What you do is you ask people to name their least liked groups, or to pick from a list of groups who they like the least. And then you ask, would you let people in that group hold a rally in your town, run for elected office, do various political things? And the more willing people are to let members of their least liked group engage in political activities, the more tolerant they're said to be. Now, interestingly, the more the students go to private school, the more tolerant they become, which is very strange. In fact, let me give you a particularly strange finding. I did a study of the Latino National Political Survey. It's a representative sample of adult Latinos. And in that survey, they asked people to identify their least liked group. The number one disliked group for adult Latinos were gay activists. And then, for most people, it's the Klan. Everyone has agreed to hate the Klan. So, but for Latinos, it's gay activists, and then people were asked how willing they'd be to let the Klan, hold a rally in their town, run for elected office. I'm sorry, how willing they'd be to let gay activists hold a rally, run for office, have a book in their library, and then they were also asked where they went to school every year when they were a kid. The more that adult Latinos attended Catholic schools when they were kids, the more willing they were to let gay activists exercise political activities. Which is very counterintuitive, right? How could that be? We created public schools precisely so they would teach this. That's a central reason for this. I have some guesses as to why this is, and we could share some of those, but it's an empirical fact that it is so. So I don't think we have much to fear from expanding choice and competition as far as our civic values go. I don't know whether it's because private schools are so wonderful or because our public schools are doing so miserably in emphasizing these values. I do think that schools have kind of lost sight of this civic mission of theirs. Perhaps it's because public schools are ultimately political organizations. They are publicly controlled and politically controlled, and therefore they have to be conflict averse. They have to be afraid of conflict because they don't want to disrupt the political coalition that governs them. And so they have difficulty addressing controversial subjects like tolerance and dislike groups because they're political. While private schools are less hindered by these political concerns and therefore are more willing to address controversial issues and therefore more effectively convey tolerance. Because to talk about tolerance is to talk about controversy. That's my best guess as to what's going on, but I don't know for sure. So anyway, I've talked plenty enough. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Let me throw in one last plug because of my friend Sandy Sotsky and Common Core. One other thing that I think is a major threat on the horizon is Common Core standards. This is the idea that we're going to have a national set of standards and a national set of assessments attached to those standards. It's described as voluntary. It's voluntary in the same sense that I voluntarily drive under the speed limit. I could go fast. My car does go faster, but they fine me if I go faster. Similarly, states don't get money if they don't adopt Common Core, so it's completely voluntary, except for that. So it wasn't voluntary, and my problem with this is that people interested in education reform ought to think like people who are a minority religion. You don't build a national church if you're a member of a minority religion, because you know that you won't control it. Someone else will, and they'll impose their religion on you, right? So you oppose a national church if you're a member of a minority religion. People interested in high-quality standards are a minority. And they have to be aware of this. And you don't want to build a national standards machine because you won't control it. Someone else will, and they will impose their nonsense on you. And so that's, I think, why Common Core is a real issue. But anyway, that's a little bomb I throw out at the end. And I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions. I can field questions if you want.
Absolutely.
I know in the back you had some special ed thoughts.
Well, on to do with Senate Bill 10, I had a couple of comments that came up because at our school several years ago when the special needs voucher program did come out, we decided to participate because we felt like it would be the entrance and gateway to a full voucher system down the road. And at the time, they were only taking a select number of schools that were SACS accredited or they had a list of other qualifications you could meet. One of the key things people need to remember is that in the state of Georgia, private schools are not regulated. And so that leaves the floodgates open for a lot of different things to go on in private schools that many people are unaware of. And that is actually how we started our school, because even I was unaware of the fact that private schools weren't regulated. So when we started with SB 10, we were at the government's mercy.
SB 10 is the special ed voucher bill?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, Senate Bill 10. And at the time, you would enroll a student, and they would come to you with the social security number. You can key it into the system and get a voucher amount. Well, for us, the lower the amount, the more likely we would be to serve their needs. And they would start around $3,500 and escalate up to about $15,000. Well, if somebody came in and you looked up and saw that they were at $12,000 to $15,000 range, you didn't even really need to speak to the student. You could almost always say, we couldn't serve their needs. That would be like an autistic child with moderate to severe needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a school, a private school, you
So it was the case that the voucher amount was fixed for everyone, same for everyone?
Yeah, it varies. No,
varies.
Not everyone. It varies depending on the services you received in school. So
But it was up to a cap that was not
Right.
actually the full amount spent on the child in the public schools.
Well, they said it was.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's what they tell us. So a child coming to us for, let's say, speech or
Sounds like disabled kids are not very burdensome financially since they're so cheap.
Say it again?
Sounds like disabled kids are not very burdensome on public schools because they're
That's
so
right.
cheap.
That
I think
would
that's
be
useful
true.
information.
Because for a child to receive $15,000 for, let's say, an autistic student, no one in our area can serve needs. Those schools are normally down in downtown Atlanta, and you would
Right.
probably maybe send a more moderate or severe child, let's say, to the Atlanta speech school. Well, tuition can be up to $22,000, so you still have a $7,000 difference that the parents fully expected to pick up, which is not.
And could they supplement? They could
But
supplement.
parents could supplement, sure.
Okay.
But the problem is, now this is the catchy part, so if you come in and let's say you're the $15,000 person, and you
Right.
go to a school that is $16,000, so you agree to supplement the $1,000. But when your child moves into 6th grade, the tuition goes up $5,000. Well, you don't have any sliding
Right.
scale, you're
Right.
still stuck at $15,000 because that was your entrance point.
I see.
Or better yet, let's say that you are a student and your cap value is $9,000, but the school costs $7,000.
Right.
You go to $7,000, and in 2 years, when you go to 6th grade and the tuition goes up, you're still at $7,000. So
Right.
you have to leave the school unless you can afford the difference.
Right.
The problem is the office staff is all of 1 or 2 people in the state of Georgia. So what happens as a school is they dictate how you're going to get paid, which is 4 times a year. In the first couple of years, they would send you a check when they felt like sending you a check.
Right.
So school starts in August, we got our first check like mid-December.
Mm-hmm.
Private schools can't really deal with that type of financial constraint. So they have done a little bit better job, but not much better. But you would not believe the amount of fraud that we saw and we still see today, because there's no standard set. You don't measure the students when they say you're supposed to. They never check records. They never see the point they enter into.
Fraud on whose part?
Yeah. Fraud on, it's allowed fraud that's happened because of the private schools that are accepting monies and not providing services to those children. Under No Child Left Behind, you're entitled to speech and language services,
Right.
but a lot of schools do not require those, request them, or anything from the public schools.
Do the parents want them?
Sure, but they're,
Why don't they go back to the public schools if that's important to them? Why are they in the private school?
because a lot of times those children are being told, well, you're gonna have to be in a special class or in special ed, and it's the old stigma of special ed where children are drooling and it's such a severe thing. And it's not that way anymore, but it's perceived to be that way. So for many parents, you will see this pattern with special needs children. They move from school to school to school. There is a lot of transition because they're always searching for the magic answer.
Right.
And so we see children that, matriculate to 7th, 8th, 9th grade, and there's still that concern. And so by that point, they're grade levels behind because of all these issues. And typically, they would be lucky to get one of the lowest paying jobs in our, in our economy, because they just don't have life skills. They're not getting the education that they need. So it's really a tragic thing for many, many
Well,
families.
the politically advantageous thing about special ed vouchers compared to vouchers targeted towards disadvantaged students is that disabilities are evenly distributed in the population. So they're as present among rich people as poor people. And so one of the traps that voucher plans have gotten into is that they, both out of their genuine interest in social justice and in order to win over skeptics, have said, well, we'll have vouchers only for the neediest kids, only for the most disadvantaged kids. And the trouble with targeting a voucher program in that way is that you create a program without a constituency to advocate or defend it. Because the same populations that are the most disadvantaged tend to be the least capable of, they have the fewest political resources to advocate for a plan. Now, the interesting thing about a special ed voucher program is that it helps rich and poor alike, but at least it includes rich so that the rich can advocate for it. It's the genius of Social Security. I mean, Social Security really helps poor people the most, but rich people get it too, which is why it's defended and not cut, and has a COLA, and while welfare, stinks. It doesn't have a COLA, and the benefits go down over time, and because that goes to poor people, and poor people are not as politically advantaged and dependent. Yeah, here and then here. Yeah.
Well, you're still in special ed.
No, we can talk about it.
A segue into what you're talking about. Well, I'm a public school teacher, and what I see is the students who do the least well are the ones whose parents are not involved.
Right.
So how do you answer that question of, choice? What I'm hearing here is choice is all about going to a private school. Well, these kids don't have transportation. They can't stay for tutoring because they have to ride the bus home.
Right. Right.
How does that all work?
Well, okay. First, a program could be beneficial even if it doesn't help everyone. So there are some people who are involved as parents, but who lack choices, who, if you gave them choices, could and would use them. Okay? And just because there are other people who wouldn't doesn't mean that we wouldn't want to help the people who could. What's more is we know because of increased competitive pressure that even the people who wouldn't use it benefit, right? Because even those who remain in traditional public schools experience an improvement in their outcomes too. So you don't have to be an active chooser to benefit from the choice program. And then, yeah. So I think that it's true that, well, I guess my second point that I would make to this is that the motivation, difficulties in a child's home life are certainly an obstacle to desired educational outcomes, but they're not insurmountable obstacles, and part of the job is to figure out strategies to overcome those things. Similarly, doctors have patients who have varying levels of motivations to do the things that are necessary to maintain their health. I mean, patients come in and they eat too much, or they smoke, or whatever, okay? And you rarely hear doctors say, those patients, they smoke, and they're overweight, and so, how do you expect me to do anything? They don't say that. They say, well, look, first I try to motivate them to change what they do. They see that as part of their job. And the second is they try to figure out how to make a difference on the margins. Given that their patients are overweight or smoking, they still, prescribe the Lipitor to see if and it helps on the margin, right? So doctors still help, even though they have unmotivated sometimes patients. What?
Contrary patients.
They may have. So we can't use the fact that some families are not, sufficiently interested in education as an explanation.
I have a comment on that.
I just want to say that.
Can we go late? I'm okay. I don't care.
If any of you feel the need to have to leave and get on with the rest of your Saturday, please don't feel bad about that. I know we have tons of questions for Jay, and he's happy to stay as long as you have questions.
Right, I'm here so that I'm not bored. So
I have a point.
I just want to hear and then hear.
There's a point on her.
Oh, you have a direct point.
Just that not a researcher.
Yeah.
And our experience with what we've done with our student scholarship organization is brief. But when we were at the Michelle Rhee Town Hall, they had a mother there, and I used to teach in DeKalb, and I know about uninvolved parents, who said, please don't say we're not involved. And what we found is that 73% of our recipients, because we give scholarships only to low-income families or minority, the average award is $4,800, and so parents still have to come up with $1,000. And the average household is a household of 4, single guardian, with an income of $28,000. And they still pay, and they still find a way to get to the school somehow. I don't know exactly how, but they do it.
Well,
They
let
are
me
motivated.
just briefly add, there's actually some interesting evidence, experimental evidence from the voucher program in DC, getting you this nice apple-to-apple comparison.
Yeah.
And what they found is that if students won the lottery for a voucher, their level of knowledge about their school and accuracy of their knowledge went way up. In other words, part of the lack of involvement and lack of knowledge on the part of parents is because, well, why bother? I mean, it doesn't make any difference. I can't do anything about it anyway.
Yeah.
So why should I? But if you empower people with choices, they might become more involved. And in fact, experimentally in DC, that has happened. Yeah.
The four
Yeah, I was
interested that you commented that one of the difficulties was data. And I think one of the great obstructions to any public education reform is that you have to look no further than the Atlanta public school system to understand that it ain't necessarily so.
Right.
Georgia reports every year high school graduation rates. They ain't necessarily so. Out of the 150 school districts in Georgia, some of them report accurately.
Right.
Some of them make it up.
Okay.
And others try to fill out the form, and then we try to make policy decisions based on data that is inaccurate. Georgia has been working for 25 years to put together a student database.
Right.
They're real close to finish.
Right. When I was saying I couldn't get data, it's not just my problem. Is that I was in long negotiations with people in the governor's office to try to get access to that, and it was just a nightmare. It was very hard to get it, and and it's very, very easy for school systems to block researchers from accessing, even if they possess accurate data, they can block it. They can just say FERPA, which is the federal law governing student privacy. Now, in truth, you can protect student privacy with no problem. I mean, we similarly have federal regulations regarding medical information, and yet it's so much easier to get individual level medical information, descriptive identifiers, to do research than it is schools. And that it's not truly a problem of privacy, it's truly a problem of an unwillingness to be scrutinized. Florida is very willing to be scrutinized. Most states are not, including Georgia. But then you have a second layer of problem, which is that maybe even the information that Georgia's collecting is inaccurate. If, for example, there's cheating on tests, something like that, then the state would be getting incorrect information. But that's another problem of successful implementation. I mean, you can have the right policy, but if you decide that you're not going to implement it, that you're not going to take any of the reasonable steps to ensure test integrity or the accuracy of the data you collect, then and you don't punish anyone for their transgressions of that, then you're going to have another problem. So, yeah.
This is going back to something you said earlier about productivity in public education. You said it's not the people but the design.
Yeah.
And as a parent who had a daughter in a traditional public school system, I felt as if though their attempts at differentiated learning wasn't exactly working well for my daughter who was slightly above average.
Right.
Because it didn't seem as if though there was a program for the slightly above average kid to rise to become excellent. It was more or less, okay, that kid's okay, so let me focus on these other kids.
Right.
What does the data say about differentiated learning environments and how teacher quality?
Yeah.
Because I think if you have a dynamic teacher, it should work. But if you've got a mediocre teacher in a differentiated learning environment, it's
I think you just hit it on the head there, which is so differentiated learning for those not used to the edubabble is the idea that you should try to target the appropriate instruction for each child. This is a very, very difficult task when you have highly varied students in the same classes. But this is the the thing that all teachers in training are told that they should do. It's not obvious how exactly you're supposed to do it, and the way that people have said we need to reach this goal of differentiated learning is by reducing class size. So part of the push for reduction in class size is so that we can have better differentiated instruction. The problem, as you correctly point out, is that there's a trade-off between quantity and quality of teachers. So in our push for lower class size, we've hired an army of teachers. It's currently the case that 3.2 million people are working as public school teachers right now. Our country has 300 million people, okay? So more than 1 out of every 100 people, adults, children, retirees, is currently working as a public school teacher. It's really hard to have 3.2 million excellent teachers. It just strains our labor pool to have 3.2 million of them. And so what we've had is we've increased the number of teachers, but we've reduced their average quality. And so, which is more important for your child's education, having a better teacher on average or having fewer other kids? Now, parents are inclined to go for the fewer other kids because they think they have no ability to influence. They think the teacher's a given. The teacher's the same no matter what. That's not true. And when they're asked if they would like a smaller class, they hear it like, would you like to have a personal chef? Yes, I'd like to have a personal chef. But they're imagining Emerald, and instead they get the fry guy. Now, how could we get differentiated instruction without straining our labor pool? Well, choice is one of the ways to do that. You allow people to find the kind of school with the kind of pedagogy, with the kind of ability level that hits where your kid is. Now, it's hard to have it all be perfect, and we make trade-offs when we go to restaurants. Not everything is seasoned exactly to our taste, but we have choices among restaurants. So if we like spicier food, we can go to the spicier restaurants. And if we like milder food, we go to the milder restaurants. And we can do that because we have choices. And so one of the other benefits of choice, in addition to its effect on